I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. Well, happy National Forest Products Week.
I know, it's really exciting. You know, last week we were celebrating Tree Week here at UK and across Kentucky. And this week across the nation, we're celebrating National Forest Products Week. And, you know, we've had activities going on all week here on campus. Chad Nyman, who works in our shop, has been on the show many times. He's been coordinating and running those efforts. On Monday, we had the Kentucky Forest Industry Association over here. We had a big cookout and grill out and doing some really great stuff. And Chad's got some other activities going on, but we're going to have Chad talk a little bit about forest products and National Forest Products Week. And then also we're going to have Dr. Jacob Muller. He's going to be talking about something we get a lot of questions about, Renee, all the time, about carbon and carbon markets and, you know, what's going on with those. So we've got Jacob going to be talking about some of that stuff. And so pay attention to both of these segments. They're going to be really good ones. We're glad you all are with us. If you have any questions for our presenters, you can use the chat function. If you're on Facebook Live, use the comments and we will try to get back to you there. But delighted to be with you today, Renee.
Definitely. So you know what? Let's go ahead and get started. Chad, if you want to turn your camera on. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Doing well. How are you all today?
Good.
Great. Glad you're here, Chad.
Tell us a little bit about National Forest Products Week before you start your presentation.
Absolutely. So a little bit of history to this. Congress, the U.S. Congress, declared the first National Forest Products Week back in 1960. So we've had many years to celebrate National Forest Products Week. And over the years, many governors of individual states have recognized through proclamations declaring just how important these forests and forest products are. And so we've got a bit of history dating back to 1960, and we think about, you know, the rotation of our forests and how that's changed over time, and how when our forest resources have been less than what they are now, how, you know, people really recognize that. And as our forests have grown, we have very mature forests nowadays. And so we really look back on those times when we haven't had these mature forests that we do today.
All right. Well, looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. And so this year, our theme for Forest Products Week was Forest Products Are All Around Us, and just trying to talk about all of the many different ways that these forest products touch our lives and make our lives better and those around us, and lessen our environmental impact, and so many great things that these forests and forest products provide to us. And so in Kentucky, we have about half of our state is in forest cover, and largely private forest land ownership. So a lot of individual folks that own those forests and family forests. And so what is a forest product? So there's a few definitions out there. I pulled this one from the Society of American Foresters, and they define a forest product as any raw material that's yielded by a forest, generally defined in forest acts or ordinances, and subdivided conventionally into major forest products. Those include timber and fuel wood, minor forest products, all other products including leaves, fruit, grass, fungi, resins, gums, animal parts, water, soil, gravel, stone, and other minerals on forest land, which is a very broad and inclusive definition, a lot more than what some of the common definitions out there in the dictionaries are. But it's a great way to think about forest products and what they actually are. And so when we get thinking about these, we can kind of break these timber products down into a few different categories just to help understand them a little bit better. And so we've got these timber forest products. And so we think, you know, wood and logs and lumber, veneer, wood chips, sawdust, all of those types of timber forest products. And then we get into some non-timber forest products. So the U.S. Forest Service classifies any product or natural resource that is not traditional timber or fiber products as special forest products. And those can include products like floral greenery, Christmas trees and boughs, mushrooms, transplants of trees, shrubs, or herbaceous plants, cones, medicinal plants, cuttings, herbs, nuts, berries, and pitch from pine trees. And so Medicinal plants, a lot of folks don't think about the many medicines that come from our forests and woodlands. And so aspirin is a good example of a medicine that comes from the willow tree. And there are others. And so what do non-timber and timber forest products have in common? Um, they're all great, but the big thing is they all have that connection to the trees and the forest woodland ecosystem communities. And so why would we want to celebrate National Forest Products Week? We've named a few great ideas and reasons why already, but we want to recognize the many values of forests and the products that they create. It also gives us a chance to acknowledge the value of woodlands and instill that commitment of good stewardship and conservation practices that help us to responsibly manage all of those forests for future generations. So we did talk a bit already about this history of National Forest Products Week, and we know this goes back till 1960, and that's when Congress designated that the third week of October would be recognized as Forest Products Week. And so our renewable forests and products that we extract are so important that we know that we've had presidents and governors on both sides of the political aisle make proclamations and recognize the importance of these forests and woodlands and the products that come from them. I've got just an example here of what the Kentucky governor's proclamation looks like. It has some different claims on there talking about the forests of Kentucky that cover half the state and all of those contributions that they provide to us. And so we know that these forests and forest products provide a lot of benefits for all of us, in addition to that clean air and clean water. These healthy, productive forests, they help build this renewable economy that renewably creates products, all while creating jobs and improving the health and quality of our lives. And so we think about, so many choices we have to make in a day, and the things that we purchase. We're all consumers, and so we just try to make the best choices we can. Thinking back, reduce, reuse, recycle, and looking at the forests and forest products, I added to that, renew. So reduce, reuse, recycle, and renew. Just some, terms to think of as you go through your daily choices. So we think about where our wood and forest products come from. The more local that wood is coming from, the better that is, both in terms of jobs and getting that material to a facility where it can be processed, keeping the cost of doing that low. The more that we have an awareness of our supply chains and manufacturing that we all rely upon, there's great benefits from all of that. And the more that we build these local and regional supply chains, adds more value to those products and employment locally. So we know these wood products are all around us. They fill our homes, our schools, our offices, the bones of our homes. The framing is wood in a lot of cases, and it's the most environmentally friendly choice that we can select when we're picking materials to use. Concrete and steel always have a place, but we want to use those in the best locations, the most needed locations. There's so many forest products that are within our schools, offices, and homes all around us that we use daily and don't think of. Another thing that is something that another energy generation type of way of looking at wood and forest products is wood heat. So we're talking, cordwood, traditional firewood, or pellet stoves, the occasional Duraflame log. All of those different types of wood heat, they may not seem like a large chunk of the energy to drive heating of our homes throughout the winter. This cold weather helps us think a little bit about the winter to come. And so just looking at Kentucky, about 3% of Kentuckians use wood as their primary heat source. That puts us a bit above the national average, which is about 1.3%. It doesn't sound like a lot when you think about it, but that 1.3% is about 1.7 million households across the US that are using wood heat. So it's a good component of that energy portfolio that we have. So we know that wood is important in construction nowadays, and that other materials are important as well. But wood is going to be the future in our construction of large buildings, multi-story facilities, schools, office buildings. And it's going to be due to a lot of these benefits that we know, the carbon storage potential by using wood and more wood in our structures. It's been documented in a lot of different literature. There was a study by Andrew Ruff, which came out in 2020 and discussed the ability to store gigatons of additional carbon in our structures. And so using these type of mass timber, cross-laminated timber materials has the ability to reduce environmental impact of building through choosing these materials as opposed to others that might be more carbon intensive. So we know that using wood in a building allows it to be a long-lived wood product. That building, as long as it's standing and in use, that carbon in those wall and ceiling and floor panels will be stored. Now, there's also some benefits when we look at the construction timeline with these pre-made panels. So prefabricated solid panels being able to be made off-site somewhere and delivered to that job site, set up with a crane pretty quickly. It allows for the construction timeline there on the job site to speed up quite a bit, which has significant cost savings for construction crews and for construction project completion. And so there's benefits for the materials comparatively, there's benefits financially for that construction timeline. And we know the biophilic properties, the benefits that we experience from being in a structure that has more wood and how that affects our health. And so we also know that this wood is an insulate material, so it's a great insulator. It has the potential to be able to reduce urban heat sink in our cities and be able to reduce the temperature that those cities are by the construction materials that we're using in our buildings. So if you would like to find out more about mass timber, Woodworks is a great resource. I'd like to promote the resources that they have available. There's a lot of great resources there. So as we get thinking about other avenues, housing is extremely important to our everyday lives. The places, the buildings that we are working in and going to school in and learning are so important. The forest foods, some of these, may be a little bit further removed from your everyday life, but persimmons are a great treat this time of year as they're dropping from the trees. Wildlife love these. They're one of our great native hardwood trees, the persimmon tree, and the fruit from that is a delicious fruit. We also have pawpaws and many different types of nuts. Maple syrup is a very sweet forest product, if you would, and different mushrooms that we're able to grow in our woodlands. So many tasty forest foods that we're able to grow and consume. And depending upon where you're at regionally, there's a variety of different ones. If you're in the South, pecans are very well known. If you're further out west, Northern California is known for their almonds and other nut growing operations. There's a ton of wonderful forest foods that we enjoy all the time and probably don't consider. We think about cooking with wood. So charcoal was actually humanity's first manufactured product. We have a long, lengthy history of using charcoal. Nowadays, there is different types of pellet smokers that use wood and a wide variety of options to be able to cook with wood nowadays. And so with charcoal or with wood pellets, those are made from wood scraps, what we call residues, that are left over from lumber production in Kentucky. And so a very great sustainability story there. We're producing lumber and all the material, the scraps that are left over end up going into products like charcoal or wood smoking pellets that can be used for cooking. We know that bourbon has a huge footprint here in Kentucky. But lesser known is the impacts of wine and other spirits that are also aged in those white oak barrels. So when we're talking about bourbon specifically, there is actually a federal law that requires that that barrel be a new charred white oak barrel, what we call a cask. And so that barrel will only be used one time, and then that barrel will be used for other purposes. It'll go and be used for other spirits. There's some hot sauces that are aged in those barrels and many other products that use those barrels once they've been used in bourbon the first time. As I've said, 95% of bourbon is made in Kentucky. We know that it's a great local value-added product that ties into our agricultural system. We have about roughly a $10 billion contribution that comes from those wood-aged or matured spirits to our Kentucky economy, which is very significant. And then about 70% of the flavor and all of the color imparted from that charred and toasted white oak is coming from that barrel. That white oak barrel is the most expensive ingredient in the recipe of bourbon. So we know that wood provides a variety of musical instruments. We've got guitars and banjos and dulcimers and violins, pianos, so many more instruments. And we all know how much that music can benefit our lives and add so much to our culture. We have had some activities, as Billy mentioned, around campus. And we had a walking tour around campus where we visited some of the places around campus that wood is being included in the architecture, design, or other aspects of the campus living to be able to improve how things are in those areas. And in our dining facility, we walk in and there's a lady who's playing piano, just to kind of set the stage for what I'm going to play a short video here. So she's playing piano in the dining hall, and we have these very large reclaimed horse fencing doors in the dining facility. And so it just the tone was excellent for starting out our wood products are all around us walking tour. It was very nice. So it was almost perfect. We didn't plan for that to happen, but walking into that dining facility, it really excited us, for a conversation about wood products, hearing that music and just having that experience start things out. But as we continued our walk, we took a few other pictures and made some stops around some other places. There's these social staircases for students to be able to study and talk to each other and do whatever type of work that they've got, a place between classes, if you will. In the Gatton Business School, they've got this nice space here where a lot of the construction that's gone on recently, they've tried to add a lot of wood to really warm the surroundings of the buildings and make it such a nice, warmer feel when you're in those kind of spaces, and to add a lot of color and different biophilic properties that we know are beneficial into those spaces for our students and campus community. And so we go from that, our campus community, into recreation. And so we think there's so many different ways that recreation is benefited from our forests and the forest products. And so there's so many in our sports equipment area. So you think, Kentucky Louisville Slugger bats, those, were all made out of ash at one point in time. They've switched to hard maple and hickory and other species to adjust with the emerald ash borer. But basketball courts made out of hard maple, and bowling lanes and bowling pins, hockey sticks, and even golf clubs. A lot of golf drivers and clubs used to be made out of persimmon. There's actually a Kentucky company that still uses persimmon to make golf clubs. Got a picture of that up top here. But just getting out and hiking and wildlife viewing, think about campfires and even some subsistence hunting and gathering. All of these things that we benefit from recreationally from having these forests and the forest products that come from those forests. So thinking even deeper, we've had a lot of fun with some of these other ones, but just bare survival, when we get into transportation and supply chain, our forests really, this is where they come to work for us. We've got our railroad cross ties, bridge timbers, and yard timbers. So our railroads, our rail cars are literally driving on top of these forest products, the metal gauge steel that is held in place, to those wooden ties. But then you think even, you know, at a different level, all of our pallets, just moving these goods to stores from manufacturing facilities. And then you load all these pallets of stuff into a semi trailer. And so you think about every semi trailer you pass going down the road, all of the floors in theirs, and even some of the interior has got a lot of wood in there. All of these floors in these trailers is solid wood, and it's been laminated and glued together for strength. And so we think about how many of those semi trailers are out there hauling our goods around. So those are riding on our forest products as well. Historically, our personal vehicles, you think, the word floorboard in a vehicle, it got that term because it was actually made out of wood at one time. A lot of components in our personal vehicles have gone to metals and other materials, but there's a deep history in our personal vehicles relating back to that wood usage. And then looking, nowadays we've got, airports around the country, different airport terminals, and some of those are expanding to meet the needs of folks and travel. And so we're seeing some of these airports using mass timber and more wood in the construction of those ceilings and of those airport terminals. One for the heating and cooling, those properties we talked about with wood being naturally insulative, but also the ability to show off and accent that wood. When we think about packaging, almost everything you buy comes in packaging to protect the goods from damage and to allow for sanitation. There are sustainability labels that help to inform consumers of the contents of the packaging. There's a USDA certified bio-based product label. Here's an example of one type of a certification, third-party certification label with the FSC here. And so there's a ton of different labels out there that exist, but just thinking about those packages that our food and other goods are coming in, how that helps to keep us safe and keep those products good for a longer period of time, and how that all plays into the whole plan of getting those products to the consumer. And just going into forests and forest products and how they bolster our agriculture and manufacturing. If we looked nationwide, we would probably see a lot of different ways that this bolsters our agriculture and manufacturing. But thinking in Kentucky terms, we've got, enormous barns all over for many different purposes, but horses is one that stands out. This is actually one of the largest structures in North America, which is a horse barn in central Kentucky. And so we've got a rick house here storing all these barrels of bourbon in here. And think of all this fencing that keeps our horses and cattle and other livestock in where they're supposed to be in their pastures. And so our forests and these products, they really do help us bolster our agriculture and manufacturing. All of the Post-it notes in North America are made in central Kentucky over in Cynthiana. And so as you purchase any types of products like that, you think about how you're employing folks in Kentucky and supporting that. I'll talk about nanocellulose briefly. This is getting into the nanomaterial side of things. So we're talking about nature's super polymer when we're talking about nanocellulose. So it's extracted from cellulose, which is one of the basic components of plant cell walls. And it's actually the world's most abundant natural polymer. So it's made up of nanofibrils, so small fibrils that have been isolated from the cellulose fibers that are found in the wood and grasses. And so future products, everything from food packaging to biomedical devices. I've heard for smartphones and tablets and armor for vehicles and so many different things that can tie into the nanocellulose in the future. I just want to talk real briefly about this economic contribution from Kentucky's forests. We know that just in the forest industry sector, there's a contribution of over 13 billion annually in 2021 and 53,000 jobs overall. So if you'd like to learn anything more about forest health, forest management, forest products, or other woodland resources, I'd like you to go to the ukforestry.org page. We do have a sawmill demonstration going on the front lawn of the Thomas Bo Cooper Forestry building from 11 to 1 tomorrow. And Megan Bueland is going to be making paper from forest mushrooms Friday from 10 to 12 out there on the Thomas Bo Cooper Forestry building lawn. That is all that I have for this talk, and this is my contact information.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chad. We greatly appreciate that presentation. And, I'm glad that you went over so much, because I don't really think people realize how much the forest affect their lives.
Absolutely. It really touches every aspect of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, trees are the answer, right, Billy?
Yes, they are always the answer. Yeah. Yes, I love it, Chad. I get to work with woodland owners a lot, and they're that first leg in that supply chain. But it's so neat to kind of see them grow those trees, and then they turn into beautiful products that we can all use and benefit from. So it keeps that cycle going.
Right.
Absolutely. It's a great story.
Yeah. Thank you, Chad. We greatly appreciate you being on, and I'm sure we'll have you on again.
Yeah. All right. Celebrate Forest Products Week, folks.
Exactly. All right. So moving on, we're going to talk about carbon markets and carbon storage. And what exactly is that?
Yeah, we get lots of questions about this, Dr. Muller. People are wondering what they can do and what is this and how to navigate the situation.
Yeah, I'm getting more and more emails and phone calls about forest carbon than I think any other topic right now. So it's a really important topic for a lot of landowners, and they're curious about what it is, what opportunities there are, and we'll talk about some of that today.
Cool. Looking forward to it.
There we go.
Gotcha.
All right.
Looks good.
Looks good. Okay. Yeah. So as Renee mentioned, we're going to be talking about forest carbon markets, specifically for Kentucky woodland owners, but there's some broad information that'll apply to others, even if you're outside of Kentucky, but really kind of focused on the central hardwoods area, central Appalachia. Right. So we know, as Chad mentioned, forests are used for so many things, right? All of these amazing wood products that Chad went through, from musical instruments to furniture to all these nano technologies. They're also really important for ecosystem function, right? And for helping us capture carbon, right? They've perfected this method of capturing carbon out of the atmosphere and turning that into very useful byproducts that we use as humans. And one of the great things about using forests as opposed to other technologies to try to capture carbon is there's really no construction or no upfront costs to getting into storing and capturing carbon. Right? It uses forestry, which is an established science, industry, and method for managing the land. Right? It offers long-term storage. Right? We talk a lot about forest carbon and the storage in the landscape, but we can also think about carbon storage outside the forest through so many of those amazing products that Chad was talking about, these wood products, that we can actually extend the length of carbon storage from forest sustainable management to sustainable use of our wood products. And there's so many secondary benefits for using forests and thinking about forests as ways to capture and store carbon. And we're going to talk about that and a number of other opportunities, including some that might be beneficial to your pocket books or your bank accounts, right? But let's back up just a little bit. Okay. So we know that there's carbon, and we know that they interact somehow with trees and forests, right? But how they interact is really through this process called photosynthesis, right? Where this carbon dioxide, so the CO2 comes into the plant, into their stomata, to be exact, as well as light. So light radiation coming in from the sun, and water, so HO2 coming up through the roots. And combining these, so the CO2 and the HO2, we go through this photosynthesis process, which creates sugars and oxygen, right? And those sugars are used by the plant to grow, right? To accumulate fiber and to accumulate volume in their forests or in their trees, right? And then the other byproduct is oxygen, right? And that's a product that is, I don't need to explain how important that is for us, but in that carbon, that's where that carbon is stored. In that sugar, that's where the carbon is stored, right? So we get CO2 from the atmosphere, comes in through photosynthesis to create these sugars and stores the carbon in the tree itself, and it stores it in a number of different locations, right? In fact, most of that storage goes down into the soil, right? That organic matter that the tree is growing in. But specifically in the tree, most of that is in where you would expect it to be, those woody parts of the tree. So the trunk and the branches account for most of the carbon in a tree, and then the roots, and then lastly in the leaves, right? So it doesn't seem like a too abstract of an idea to think about kind of the ranking of this storage of carbon, right? So the wood is number one, long-term storage, decades into centuries and even longer, depending on those wood products, right? And then the roots at the number two, storage for carbon in the tree, and that's can also be extended from decades into centuries. And lastly, the leaves, and those are really a short-term storage, right? Here in Central Appalachia, we look outside, see all the beautiful trees that are turning colors, or the leaves are turning colors and beginning to drop, and that's going through this annual cycle, this annual carbon cycle of growing, storing, decay, releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. So that's really short-term storage. And when we think about the development of forests, not all forests are created equal when we're considering the age and the structure of the forest. So when we have a young forest, this is really when we're thinking about a really rapidly growing forest, lots of competition, so there's higher mortality, trees are competing for resources and sunlight. The smaller trees have limited storage ability, but they are growing really fast, so it is bringing in carbon, right, from the atmosphere. But ultimately, it's rather poor at storage, just because there's not those big branches and trunks that are storing a lot of carbon for a long time. Then we've got that maturing forest, right? This is kind of pretty classical example of most of our forests, or what state they could be in if managed properly, right? The growth has started to slow down a little bit from those young, rapid, kind of reaching for the sun and competition. And this is best at sequestering carbon. So bringing in carbon, there's some mortality in these forests, as we all know. trees grow, individual trees might die, or certain disturbances might happen that kill individual trees. And so we do lose some carbon in this process, right? But it's really good at storing. Then when we think about old growth, we actually have very few pockets of old growth here in central Appalachia, or anywhere in Appalachia. In these old growth forests, there's not a lot of net growth, right? There's a lot of older trees, but also younger trees coming in when given the opportunity to grow, but there's lots of mortality, lots of decay. So it is a carbon sink, and it's good at storing carbon, but it's not necessarily pulling in as much carbon as these more healthy maturing forests. Okay. And also, not all forest types are created equal, right? Similarly to the old growth forests, rainforests are very rapidly growing but rapidly decaying, and they're not ultimately that great at storing carbon. With the boreal forests, this is kind of on the other end of the spectrum. So it's slow growing, so slow decay, so slow release of carbon back into the atmosphere, but it is good at storing carbon. And then we kind of have this sweet spot, right? This temperate forests where we're at here in Kentucky and central hardwoods, where there's moderate levels of growth, moderate to slow levels of decay, but it's excellent at storing, right? The hardwood trees, the denser trees that store carbon, is really this excellent forest type for thinking about carbon. Right? So just to summarize this forest carbon, so trees are great at sequestering and storing carbon. The forests sequester and store carbon in the trees and in the soil, and we might want to focus on younger and maturing forests if we're thinking about managing specifically for carbon. Right? And again, the temperate forests are key to making an impact globally, at least, right? So how do we grow carbon? Keeping forests, protecting forest health, encouraging growth, right? So maintaining those healthy forests that are maturing and growing, and sustainable forest management practices. Okay. So this little figure just kind of shows a hypothetical model of carbon storage, right? Where we have trees that are growing their above ground carbon over time. And then we have forest management, right? We might harvest some trees and reduce that amount of above ground carbon. But in doing so, we might accelerate or re-accelerate kind of the capture and storage of that forest, right? So a managed forest potentially has more opportunity to bring in and store more carbon than unmanaged forest, right? And this is important when we talk about forest markets and how we can include forest management in carbon kind of under this same management plan or management philosophy for our own woodlands and forests. Right. So that might include some slightly different practices, though, perhaps focusing more on longer rotations. So trying to maintain the growth for longer periods of time before we go in and remove, minimizing soil disruptions, and limiting damage to remaining trees. Right? These all fall in line with this idea of sustainable forest management. Okay, so we've talked about carbon, how it goes from the atmosphere to the tree, how we can manage forests to best utilize carbon, right? And this topic now is really one that is driving a lot of curiosity in landowners and managers. What is it, and how might I benefit from carbon? Right. And we're just really at the beginning of thinking about carbon storage, at least for smaller landowners. Right. So I will preface all of this by saying there's still a lot of uncertainty in the trajectory of carbon in the carbon markets here in the US and in the central hardwoods. But let's talk real quickly about some of those barriers. Okay. A large part of US forests are family-owned forests, and even more so here in Kentucky, where of the forested land that we have, which is 45% or so of the total land coverage, almost 90% of that is owned by family forests, right? So a large chunk of US forests, and particularly here in Kentucky, is family-owned forests. But when we look at the actual markets, right, the registered projects in these carbon markets, almost all of those projects, 98% of those are for large land holdings, right? Not your typical smaller family-owned forest. So you see that darker shading, those are the registered projects. And that lighter shading, that's the actual total acreage of ownerships, where most of it is in smaller land holdings, less than 100 acres. But most of the projects, these carbon markets, are in these larger acreages, right? So it's kind of this discrepancy in the access to these markets, where folks, larger corporations that have more land, are also having easier access to these markets. Okay. There are two types of markets: compliance markets, and those are strict markets laid out and regulated by the state. You can think of like California carbon markets. And then there's the voluntary markets. And this is what we're seeing here in Kentucky, in this region. And almost all of these programs are voluntary. Okay. Still, most of these programs are for larger land holdings, okay, 1,000 to 25 acres minimum. Recently, there's been a focus back towards these smaller land holdings. We've looked at those figures that I showed a minute ago, with kind of that disproportionate percentage of carbon markets in these large acreages, right? So there's been a number of efforts to allow more access to smaller land holdings, or landowners that have smaller acreages, right? Between 25, 50 acres is fairly common. Okay, so we've got two current options, right? If you've paid attention to carbon markets, you've probably seen NCX, right? The Natural Capital Exchange. And this is one opportunity that's currently available for Kentucky forest landowners, right? This is a timber deferment, right? It's a 1-year contract where they use their remotely sensed data and their algorithms and all of their technology to remotely assess the potential that you have in your woodland. So you give them information about where your forest is, some coordinates, and they kind of do a lot of the inspection remotely, and will assess kind of your potential for carbon storage and your access to the markets. Right? And there's no guarantee that any landowner will get into these markets. And it's not totally transparent what sort of criteria might limit you from accessing it, but they're looking for landowners that have that potential to store carbon, right? So this is one that a number of folks are asking about, NCX. There's still a lot of unknowns about kind of the long-term impact of actual carbon storage on the landscape. But this is certainly one opportunity that is available to folks in Kentucky. Coming soon is another program, right? The Family Forest Carbon Program. And this is supported by the American Forest Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, and the Audubon, right? The National Audubon Society. And this is really supporting a working woodland. Okay? It understands that there's smaller land ownerships that don't have that access to these carbon markets, but managing a forest is still a very important component to promoting sustainability, removing invasive plants, periodically getting timber revenues from their forests. and those shouldn't exclude someone from entering into a carbon market. And so that's kind of been the goal for this FFCP program. And there's a couple different options, from growing mature forests, so maintaining at least 25% or maintaining at least 75% of your initial basal area, so the amount of the density of your woodland. And there's another program that's promoting regeneration and forest health, like removing competing vegetation and controlling other invasive plants in your forest, right? So those are the two options that we're seeing here, or we're going to see here in Kentucky, right? The NCX is currently available. The FFCP is going to be available in the very near future, right? It's practice-based. Contracts are 20 to 30 years, paid over the course of the contract, and it has a minimum acreage of 30 acres, but it does allow some harvesting, so it encourages active management. Or the other option, NCX, is a deferment, a 1-year contract that's paid at the end of the contract, and there's minimum credits, not acres involved. Okay, so what I tell folks, some of these markets in these contracts can be very complex, right? When you're starting to talk about 20 or 30 years of a contract, that should make you pause, right? It should make you think, read all the fine print, and we've joked about needing a lawyer to understand and dissect all these things, but in reality, it's probably not a bad idea to have some legal advice on your woodland, right? This is a valuable asset for you, and if you're going to jump into a big contract, it should be very thoughtful and done with taking a lot of precautions. Okay. Then there's other programs, right? Finite carbon, working woodlands, blue source. These are all larger 2,000 acre plus woodlands. A few other smaller landowner opportunities in core carbon program, forestcarbon.org. Not a lot of information about those. The two that I mentioned, the NCX and the Family Forest Carbon Program, are going to be the two that you're probably going to see the most and have some opportunities to explore as a landowner. Okay, so to end, and kind of wrap up and summarize, healthy, sustainably managed forests do retain carbon, right? And its biomass in the wood and the soil. It helps prevent emissions or greater emissions of carbon back into the atmosphere, right? Sustainably managing our forests promotes all sorts of other co-benefits, from clean air to clean water, and a number of other benefits for wildlife and other opportunities such as recreation, right? And by tapping into these markets, you might be able to earn some extra money, right? That's created by the forest while also managing your forests. But there's no right answer and there's no good answer when someone comes to me asking what they should do as a landowner, right? It comes down to your management goals and objectives for your woodland, what you value, and you need to take all these things into consideration. And you can help, and you can talk to a forester about these things. A lot of these things are new topics, but we're talking more and more about them. I would encourage you to be patient as a lot of these things, as we discover more and more about a lot of these opportunities. So a lot of uncertainty, but certainly some opportunity, and we'll be here. And as these things come about, changes in the markets, other opportunities, you can trust that us here at UK Forestry are going to stay on top of that and relay any information that we get onto you, whether you're a county agent, a forester, or a landowner. So I got my contact right there, jacob.muller@uky.edu. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate that, just to kind of put it a little more in perspective.
Yeah.
Shifting landscape. But Jacob, I'm so glad that you're paying attention to this and trying to keep us abreast of what's going on, and so we can make informed decisions. Yeah, there's a lot of interest in this subject for sure.
For sure. Yep.
Definitely. Well, I'm sure we'll have you back on as things progress with
Yes, a great outlet to get the word out. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, it's great to be here. And again, if anyone has any questions, please reach out. So
I'm sure you will get them. So
all right.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks. All right. Good
Great
job.
information today. Talking about National Forest Products Week and all the different aspects of carbon markets. I mean, it's mind-boggling of all the different things that
Trees are the answer, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So
thank you all for being with us.
No, it's fine. We greatly appreciate everybody who's joined us. And, we do this every week on Wednesday at 11 o'clock, different topics every week. So you just never know what you're going to get. You can sign up for fromthewoodstoday.com on. You can let us know any kind of little topic that you might want to hear about. There might be something that you just like, I don't know what that is in my backyard. Send us a picture.
Yeah, no doubt. We often feature those things, and let other folks know about this. There's a lot of great information, a lot of stored videos there as well on that fromthewoodstoday.com. So you can just watch until your heart's content. So
binge watch. All right. Until then, we will see you next week at 11 o'clock. Take care.
Right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
From the woods today.